The most recent series of paintings, which are collectively entitled the Ensemble series and Configurations, which would have been shown at Zimmer Stewart Gallery in April, have, as you can see, been put on hold for the moment in terms of a potential show a bit later on. I see this series of paintings very much having their roots in paintings that I was making in the 1980s when I was first at art school. At that period of time, I was working very gesturally, exploring the idea of the brush mark, and in particular, the idea of the way that a brush mark would also hold a colour and how those colours would react against each other, creating a kind of visual architecture within space. Throughout the 1980s, I was working very much as an abstract artist, and that was certainly something I continued with onto my MA in printmaking. By the end of my MA, shortly after my MA, really a couple of years after, I began to have really serious doubts about the idea of making abstract painting. I think in many ways the work was very, very influenced by other people's paintings, and I felt that every mark that I was making was really just a recreation of somebody else's mark. It didn't feel like it had any kind of authenticity. During that period of time, I was drawing all the time. I was drawing every day on the train, and certainly what I began to realise in the early 90s is that the drawing was offering me a way forward. And it was eventually in about 92 that I started to work figuratively, and predominantly I've worked with a figure ever since in different guises. I initially started to make some semi-abstract paintings. These would encompass things like everyday objects like tables, chairs, ladders featured in the semi-abstract works as well. Also these strange little kind of buildings which I called the Raincatcher series. And gradually into this kind of slightly surreal landscape figures began to emerge. I got to a certain point where I began to realise that I didn't understand enough about the figure, and so I started to draw myself. This was the model that I had most access to. So initially I took all my clothes off and started to make some large-scale drawings. These were about 4 or 5 foot high drawings. Just as I started to make this series of works, the Sicker exhibition took place at the RA, and this had a really profound influence on me, I think. It was particularly kind of something to do with Sicker's use of colour and use of mark making, this very open, kind of quite coarse image that would read as a figurative image, but at the same time it would certainly read as an abstract configuration of brush marks. I remember at the time one of my work colleagues was leaving, and I decided to give him a little Sicker copy. I decided at the last minute not to do that, but instead I made a small colour version of one of these figure paintings, roughly about 30 centimetres square. And suddenly what I realised was that I found something really exciting. There was this sudden realisation that the coloration of work that I'd been exploring abstractly and the gestural work that I'd been abstractly kind of exploring in the 80s suddenly came together in the figurative works. So I started to make a series of quite small, intimate male nude paintings, initially which I called the Changing Room series. That began to explore the idea of 1, 2, 3 and 4 figures, the idea of kind of naked men standing next to one another. There's a sense of that being quite uncomfortable and difficult, particularly if you've been a man and been in a changing room. So the idea of kind of this kind of visual tension and these kind of atmospheric tensions was at the forefront of my thinking when, very sadly, my mum died very, very suddenly. And what I began to realise is that, you know, obviously I needed to grieve about that, and the figure became this motif that held on to this grief. So I obsessively made nude paintings of myself, initially working from a mirror and 2 mirrors. That enabled me to paint myself from the front and from the back. And the series really explored 2 aspects of the body. One was just the head, and the other one the sort of back and the torso as well. I must have probably made about 900 self-portraits over a period of about 2 years. Quite obsessively making paintings, sometimes making paintings of the paintings as well. And eventually I got to a point where, you know, I'd run out of what I could do with a mirror. So I then started to use photography, and initially I was using black and white photography. And what I would do is I would set up a kind of situation in my living room. I would use tables, etc., and chairs to work at depth of field and depth of focus before I would then assume a position and set my camera on a self-timer mechanism. This is in the SLR sort of days of using film. And I took black and white photographs so that I had these images to work from, which were obviously not dictating what the colour was. Then I really explored the idea of what the figure could be doing in a space, although it was quite central that it was still me. But really I got to a certain point where I ran out of what I could do with myself, and that's when I started to then work on other people's images, and that's really what sparked the Muybridge series of paintings, and also the Thomas Eakins series of paintings as well. These were inspired by Eakins' black and white photographies of nudes bathing, and obviously Muybridge used the human figure constantly in a state of motion. More of those paintings proceeded when I got again to a certain point where I realised I'd kind of run out of visual possibilities. There was only so much I could do with this series of images. And that's roughly when I then started to set up still lives. By this stage, we're talking kind of mid-90s, getting through to the end of the 20th century. And what I started to kind of see is that we were going through quite emotionally challenging times. We had a young child, we had noisy neighbour problems, we had negative equity. We were trying to move out of Brighton at that point in time in a small one-bedroom flat. And noise had this incredible kind of infiltration into the household. It made me ill, it made my wife ill, it made us very, very tense. And I began to sort of think around the idea of how I could explore that visually. And my initial thoughts were to explore the idea of nudes listening, particularly listening to walls, because I found that I was doing that all the time. So once again, I started to kind of set up objects in the house to photograph so that I could kind of swap into position. And the self-timer mechanism on my camera stopped working. So I ended up shooting the end of the film, just shooting items of furniture. The film got damaged, and when the film eventually got processed, what I was left with is really stark, quite kind of disturbing images of furniture. And that's what then started a new series of still life paintings, which I then called the Ensemble series. So this is sort of late 90s, early 21st century. And the still life paintings I always saw as groups of figures, particularly the idea of kind of figures ill at ease with each other, figures under tension, figures experiencing quite difficult times emotionally. So the domestic objects became kind of surrogate people, and again a couple of years later I got to a point where I felt I'd exhausted that still life series. So the most recent paintings have seen a return back to that same kind of subject matter. We are living in really difficult times. Obviously, emotionally, we're all living together in small spaces. At the moment, I've got two of my daughters home. So, we're all getting on really well, but one cannot deny the fact that the last few years, there's been a very, very difficult emotional time for my family. And that tension is something that I wanted to kind of investigate. So that's really the kind of evolution of the recent paintings. The Ensemble series came from a trip to Amsterdam, which we took with the whole family, and I've always been really, really inspired by those kind of atmospheric spaces inside galleries, that sort of baroque lighting you sometimes get, particularly, often you see people lit from above. So that sort of interest in kind of voyeurism almost, looking at people, looking at artwork, I think is a really interesting kind of subject matter. And my intention for the show, which, as I say, I found out about in January, would have been to investigate this group of figure paintings. And again, the group of figure paintings have precedence in other works. In the early origins of getting a digital camera, I started to investigate the idea of long exposure photography, and I particularly became excited by the visual possibilities of photographing commuters. Largely I spent a lot of time on trains. For a 7-year period I was commuting every day for 20 hours a week, so I had thousands of drawings of commuters in my sketchbooks, and that configuration of people in compressed spaces was really exciting. So I took photographs using long exposure of people standing around Brighton Station, Victoria Station, every time I commuted. And that was roughly at the same sort of time that I started my initial series of people in galleries, which eventually kind of developed into the Turbine Hall series, where I started to look at large groups of people, initially queuing up to see artworks like the Carston Hollow test site, which was the great slide that went down the tape, but also other situations where, for instance, the Anthony Gormley exhibition, looking at artists looking at artworks in that. So the ensemble paintings were really sort of groups of people, in these dark, slightly kind of Baroque spaces, looking at largely Baroque paintings. They were looking at Velasquez and Rembrandt. I'd been to see the Rembrandt house as well recently, so that sort of idea of kind of objects in darkness was really, really exciting. And I worked on that series of works for a couple of months until, again, I sort of felt for the moment I needed to break. And I often, if you know my work, you'll realise that I work for a long period of time on one theme, one kind of motif, and then I might sort of have a break from that and I work on something else. And so then I started to look at a new series of photographs that I'd taken before lockdown started, which was to do with kind of this, emotional unrest in the house. And I'd set up these quite elaborate still lifes in the house and photographed them. But then I kind of returned back to the subject matter, set up some new still lifes as well in the new year. Again, these have largely been photographed in black and white, which opens up the possibility of colour interpretation. So what I'm left with is a kind of a rough compositional starting point, but very much the paintings evolve out of a series of kind of indecisions almost, really, putting colour down, deciding that's the wrong colour, painting over it, etc., and kind of layering things in that way. So objects, still lives, etc., kind of move around in the pictures. I suppose over the years I've made quite a comprehensive body of work. I am quite an obsessive image maker, and sometimes those images have been incredibly personal. And I would say that one of the things that I've probably realised over the last year is that I really need to make the work that I'm very, very passionate about. And if that work is dark and foreboding and uneasy, because it's coming from a dark and emotional place, then so be it. I don't really mind whether the work sells or not. It's about the fact that I need to make these paintings. In the past, I suppose, maybe 15 or so years ago, I was trying to often make work to please gallerists, sometimes kind of knee-jerk reacting to requests for work. And so I've decided not to do that. And obviously working with James at Zimmer Stewart, it's been great because James has really been open to me producing the work that I really want to produce. So I feel really strongly about this work having this emotional resonance. Now, whether the viewer sees that in the work, I don't really matter whether they get that or not. The impetus to make the work can be many and varied. Sometimes you're just fascinated by something and compelled to make an image of it, or to struggle with a visual problem. I mean, I'm not one of these artists that arrives at a kind of visual solution and then sticks with it and then produces, thousands of iterations of the same image. I'm really compelled by something for a period of time and then I like to move on. So that idea of kind of challenge, that give myself a challenge that I don't know how to do, that's a much more interesting proposition for me as a painter than doing what I already know how to do. So I think, people always bring their own baggage to bear on a picture. You can't control what the viewer sees. So I'm hoping that what the viewer sees in these most recent works is really visually compelling and exciting images, because I'm certainly moved and compelled by the source material. And I think that the paintings are really exciting. And I suppose in making the work. That's something I'm very conscious of. Is this a visually interesting painting? Is that mark a visually interesting mark? Does that mark contribute to the visual tension or the dynamic of the image? Does that colour work in a visually exciting way? So they're very formal in a sense, which again is why I think that they do relate really strongly to the abstract work that I was making early on in my career. I suppose there are times when you look inward, and there's no doubt and no mystery to the fact that a lot of my work over the last 10 years has been informed by, sadly, death in my family. My mum died over 25 years ago. My brother died 7 years ago. My dad died 5 years ago. Certainly, my brother died very, very suddenly at 56, and I'm going to be 56 in a couple of months. So that notion of mortality is something that is very present, and I think even more so with COVID-19 and the fact that I am somebody who's at risk, somebody who has to be shielded. So this idea of sort of being at home, and that sense of claustrophobia sometimes is, I think, very, very present in my thinking. At the moment, I've actually had a break from the still life paintings. I think it's a good moment to sort of step back and let the paintings breathe, and also to look at them again with fresh eyes in a couple of months' time and think, are all of these paintings working? There's some which I'm not sure if they are working, and I might do something quite radical over the top. And a lot of these paintings actually have got numerous other layers of history underneath them. There are other paintings underneath them. So that idea of kind of working through an image, although I paint quickly, sometimes things do take a long time, a couple of years to kind of evolve. So the idea of looking at the work, I think, is important, and sometimes not looking at the work. Sometimes I find that actually working on something else is really, really exciting. Another problem that I set myself is the problem of portraiture. As you probably are aware, I appeared on Sky Portrait Artist of the Year twice. Both of those were incredibly exciting days and a real challenge. So the idea of sort of painting a person and trying to capture the essence of them, their personality, their likeness, has been a problem that I've set myself. I think after my second appearance, particularly painting Angela Griffin, I found that I was very, very disappointed with the work that I did. So I set myself a personal challenge of painting every sitter in all the series. A bit of a mad project, you probably think, but I've painted about 150 portraits now, and I'm still going. And in fact, this weekend, Sky Portrait Artist have set up a new challenge, which they've called Portrait Artist of the Week. And the idea is that it's a live stream sitter for 4 hours on Sunday morning, and hundreds of people painted Akram Khan this Sunday. So I joined the queue, as it were, and set myself the same challenge. Can I paint Akram Khan in 4 hours? So I've continued to sort of set that series of works, and I try as much as possible with those portraits to make a painting within a 4-hour window, so that I'm kind of sticking to the rules, as it were. But I find that I worked on that series 2 years ago. I did a few, and then I sort of stopped. Then last year I did, pretty much all. I kept in track with the episodes and kind of worked my way through a lot more paintings. And then I put it aside again. So I've just returned back to that. So actually, when I'm making those paintings, I'm still thinking about the same kind of things that I'm thinking about in terms of these still lifes. I'm thinking about the sort of formal compositional issues, as well as that kind of series of painted marks that are marks in their own right, that relate to each other, that hold colour, but at the same time they lock onto a head. And of course, someone who's painted hundreds and hundreds of self-portraits, it's really nice to paint somebody else's head and to become new and familiar with that configuration of structures and forms. When I did my BA in fine art in the early 1980s, I was very fortunate in that we were able at that time to spend 2 months in each of the areas. So we did 2 months of painting, 2 months of printmaking, 2 months of sculpture before we then decided what we were going to specialise in. So although my main specialism was painting, I continued to make print. I did a student exchange to America in the second year of my degree, and in the States I made paintings and prints as well. That's where I learnt stone lithography in the States, and I also developed my screen printing knowledge. When I graduated, I spent a couple of years working as a slide librarian, so I got a chance to see thousands upon thousands of other people's works, and that sort of started my broadening of my contextual knowledge, and continued to paint, and then I eventually got onto an MA in printmaking, and that was at Brighton. And so really that corresponded with me getting my first teaching job in 1988, and that was to teach printmaking. So I've taught printmaking for 30 odd years, and last September I became course leader of BA printmaking at the University of Brighton, a role I'm really, really excited about. So for me, there's always been a correlation between painting and print. More often than not, I make paintings and I make prints of paintings, but in turn sometimes the prints that I make then inform the paintings. So there's this kind of flip. And I'm really excited by that notion of process, how drawings might spark the idea for photography, photography spark the idea for paintings, paintings inspire the idea for prints, prints then inspire the idea, etc., etc. So one of the things that I've done in my new role is I've tried to make a new series of prints so that I become very familiar with the print room in Brighton. We've got fantastic resources at Brighton. I've got one of the best printmaking facilities in the country. In fact, we're the only printmaking degree course in the country. So really getting to my own kind of upskilling myself, but certainly just getting to grips with that department has meant that I've produced some new screen prints, some new etchings, and some new monotypes as well. Just before lockdown, I was really keen on making some new etchings, and one of the things that I really wanted to get my head around was aquatint, and that's mostly because in my previous role at the Met, we didn't have proper aquatint. We had to put tone on a plate using spray mount. So actually getting into a proper situation where I can put a proper aquatint on a plate and actually bite it properly and really get a good knowledge of biting times has been exciting. So literally the last day that we were in the print room before lockdown, I was able to finish and just proof one of my 2 etchings of the new configuration series. So I intend to do some more. I really love, again, that interplay between black and white. Particularly love, Rembrandt's etchings, and big fan of Paula Rigo's etchings as well, particularly her use of aquatint. And of course, we can't forget people like Goya as well. So that idea of kind of objects in this dark and white space, I think is really exciting. So for me, they are, a continuation of the works, but equally they offer a different kind of language and a different kind of atmosphere. Why the objects? I suppose one of the things to think about is that chairs become surrogate people. We tend to sit on chairs. We tend to think about the personality of a chair, something which is, large and kind of well worn, or something which is thin and fragile, or likely to break. Those objects kind of hold on to ideas about people. There's something quite compelling about the table. One sits at the table to have a meal. It's a place of gathering and kind of social interaction. It's an object of stability. The table that I've got in my house, we've had for 20 odd years. It's a really sturdy table. I can stand on that table and fix lighting. Particularly at Christmas time when we're putting decorations up. The idea that the fact that the space is my space, it's my personal home, is also really interesting. Although I'm not trying to illustrate the interior of the house, like all of these things, it's a starting point. I remember 30 odd years ago, a student talking to me about ladders because I was making these semi-abstract paintings with ladders in. And he talked about a ladder as being something that you could climb up and it would give you a new vantage point. It somehow would change your perspective on the world, and I found that a really interesting idea, that ladders can be escape routes. So sometimes ladders are in the background, maybe as a space of hope. In fact, one of the last life drawing sessions that I taught at the university before lockdown, we had the model in, and it was certainly Mark's last session that he would actually get paid for over the holidays. Although actually saying that, Jake Spicer at Brighton Draw has been, giving a working wage to life models, which is really fantastic. And he has this thing set up called Patreon, which is an ability for people to subscribe and support life models. But in that last session, when we finished drawing, I had this quite good space at the university to teach life drawing in, and strangely, this weird helium balloon started floating around the space, and it seemed very macabre. It was, I was reminded of It, the Stephen King novel and film and television film as well. This strange kind of object floating around. And we had some, small bits of furniture, tables, chairs again in that space. So I took a whole series of new photographs of that. And there was something really important about this idea of the balloon. Was it an object of hope, or was it about to kind of explode and become much more challenging? So, I'm not quite sure where the chair paintings will go, but there could well be some new chair paintings and balloon paintings. I've certainly made one of those so far. So I see objects as being some metaphors, really. Lockdown, in terms of being an artist, for many of us, I think it's a great opportunity to make more paintings. I'm very, very lucky in that I have a studio in my house. So going to work, as it were, at the moment, I work at the moment on the computer. So I'm able to talk to students and give them feedback, give them tutorials, etc. Look at work on the screen, etc. But equally on the weekends, I'm able to get into the studio quite easily and make work. So. For me, being someone who's being shielded, I'm not allowed to go out, so it's even more of an opportunity to make paintings. So, the only problem I've really got is two things, really. One is the biggest one, which is running out of space for stuff to dry. So, everything's sort of pinned up on the wall. And my studio is not very big, so it soon runs out of room, and it's got lots of other things in there as well. So, one's kind of keeping packing cases and, things like bubble wrap to sort of wrap stuff up in. So that takes up room. Paintings that have yet to leave the studio need to go somewhere. So, that takes up room as well. But the other thing is materials, of course. And, of course, everybody is ordering art materials to keep themselves sane. So, I keep running out of materials and I have to order stuff, and hopefully, things arrive in time. So it's certainly very challenging times. I think we are all in a very, very unusual situation. Probably in 20 years' time, people will look back and say, what happened to you during lockdown? I'm hoping I survived this experience. Obviously, I think we all do. And hopefully, we'll look back with a degree of longing, because one of the things that I think is interesting is that often when you look at large groups of people, you see that large groups of people occupy the same space, but they don't often interact. People sort of try to avoid each other, all casts. Certainly growing up in London, that was the case. You were all crammed on a train, but nobody talked to each other. So I'm hoping that maybe when we come out of this at the other end, people will be a little bit more supportive of each other. People will communicate a bit more with each other. People will look out for other people rather than just themselves.